So welcome to the HSD Annual Roadshow. My name is Karen Moe. I'm the director of the Human Subjects Division. We like to go out on campus at least once every year and share with you some of the big changes that have happened in the last 6 to 9 months, and to talk about some of the changes that are coming in the next year, so that you're prepared and you can be thinking about how your work might be impacted. So this year in particular, we have a number of really big changes that are coming, and so we are very interested in making sure that we get the word out as far in advance and as frequently as possible. So I'm going to start by covering some of those key changes. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about some recent and some coming changes about researcher training requirements. I'd like to talk about our portfolio of 3 linked projects. One of them is the reorganization of our office. Second one is the streamlining of all of our forms and SOPs. And the third project is our electronic IRB system, which we call Zipline. I'd also like to talk about really big news, the coming changes to the federal regulations that have been proposed. Tell you a little bit about what those are and when they might change. And then finally, I'd like to end by relating that to an existing policy that was just released earlier this year from NIH about genomic data sharing. So training, first of all. Most of you probably know already that we have no required training here at the University of Washington for all UW researchers, unlike many of our peers. However, there are a number of situations in which researchers do need to obtain some training. One of those, the most common one, is whenever you receive a grant from NIH or one of the federal funding agencies, they will require that all key personnel on the grant have some kind of basic human subjects training. If you're an oncology researcher, your studies are most likely reviewed by the Fred Hutch IRB instead of the UW IRB. They also have a mandatory researcher training requirement. And then most industry-initiated clinical trials will also require at least the PI and the study coordinator to have some training, usually good clinical practice training, or GCP. But as of now, the UW as a whole still does not have a mandatory requirement. Now, how do you go about filling these requirements if you do have them, or if you'd like to obtain some optional training? These are the primary ways in which people do it. The most common is the CITI or City online training program. This is a national program that's maintained by the University of Miami. People go to the UW portal and then they register, it's all free, and they sign up for the course and take it online. Another possibility is an online course that NIH offers. And then also some people prefer to do an in-person course, which they can do through the Fred Hutch. So this is what the CITI portal looks like. So you go there and you're going to be asked to register, and then you can log in and sign up for the kinds of training that you want. The changes that we made at the end of September are with respect to the number of modules that are required in order to complete the UW training requirement and therefore meet NIH and so on. Before September 24th, it was required to take 18 to 24 different modules, depending upon whether you were going the social behavioral track, the biomedical track, or both. There was a lot of overlap between those modules, huge amount of overlap in terms of the content. It took 6 to 8 hours to complete, depending upon how fast you were, and there was no specific clear-cut refresher option if you needed to have a refresher for your funding agency, for example. So we looked at these modules, we looked at the overlap, we thought about what really mattered, what we really wanted people to know as a basic course, and what our peers were doing, and we decided to pare this down. So now the human subjects learning requirement consists of only 8 modules. There are 9 optional ones that go into some specialized areas like children, internet research, that kind of thing. The 8 required modules have minimal overlap, and together they only take about 2 hours to complete instead of the previous 6 to 8 hours. If you need a refresher course, we just advise you to retake the basic course. And that's because it is updated and refreshed so that if you're taking a refresher, for example, every 3 years, you will get some new content. So we hope that these changes make a lot of sense for researchers. It's just a much more sensible approach to getting some basic training. The other major change around our training has to do with the documentation of the training. For NIH or the federal agencies, they want to see documentation that you completed the training. And until now, there have been 2 different ways for you to do that. One is to save the certificate that you get from the program, from CITI, from NIH, or from the Hutch, and to send that to NIH or whoever. And then the other option has been that we have downloaded many of these documentations, for example from CITI, into our HSD database and made it available on our website for you to look up. Beginning next week, after November 1st, we are no longer going to be adding new information to that database on our website. We'll keep the database there until July 1st, so you can still go in and look it up. You can print things out if you don't have a certificate because you took your training 10 years ago. You can go in there and print this out. But we're not going to be adding any new data. Now the reason for that is that this is a really old database, technologically speaking. We're having increasing troubles keeping it functional as technology changes at the UW. And also we've been informed by the Attorney General's office that it is not compliant with the FERPA student records laws. It also is a huge amount of work for us to maintain. So we are going to have to stop using that. So what does that mean? After November 1st, you will need to be responsible for saving and keeping that certification that you get from whatever training program you go through, and to provide that as evidence of completion of training. If you lose it, or if you can't find it because you already took it, contact the source of the training. Or if it's on our database already, go ahead and look it up and print that out. The other option is that there is a fairly new website on the Office of Research that is called My Research Training Transcript. They download the information from CITI every night for all UW individuals, and they post it there. Anybody with a UW-Net ID can go in and look up the name of somebody on that website and find out whether or not they completed their training. What's different with our current database is that it doesn't provide you with a printed certificate of somebody who's in that database. So that certificate you still need to get either by printing something off of our current database or from the training provider. I'd also like to share with you some coming things about our training program. We are working on an overall researcher training program that is taking what's called a competency-based approach to training. That means that we focus not just on the basic knowledge, like what's provided in CITI, but also on the skills that you need to do a good job as, say, a study coordinator or a PI. So how do you fill out an IRB application? What are the special requirements at the University of Washington? Those are the kinds of things that the CITI course doesn't provide you. So what we've been doing is very slowly and with an increasing frequency over time developing this plan. We started back in 2012 and up to the present by first of all providing you with a lot of self-guided tools or self-help tools, SOPs and that kind of thing to help you navigate the knowledge and the skills that you need here at the UW. Now we've done this update to the CITI modules to make it more sensible. And starting next year, in the first half of the year, we'll be developing and providing some more skills-based training for you, connected with the release of our electronic IRB system. So we'll have some documents about exactly what you need to do to navigate through the UW system. Eventually, we expect that we're likely to have a mandatory university-wide requirement sometime in 2017 or 18 that again will consist of these two components, the basic knowledge and the skills for navigating our specific system. Okay, now I'm going to turn to talking about our linked projects, and I'll be taking questions at the end since we have to leave at 2. I want to get through the formal portion of the presentation and then take questions. So Compass is the name that we use for our portfolio of 3 linked projects. And we decided to do 3 of them all at once instead of just focusing on the electronic system, because we didn't want to just overlay new technology on our old process and our old forms and SOPs. So the first of the projects is that we've reorganized our office. This is the first time in at least 20 years, as far as I can tell, that the office has been reorganized, and the goal is to end up with more people in the office who have the expertise to more broadly advise and help campus. So we've merged, for example, our minimal risk teams with our full board teams. And the end result is that instead of 13 teams in our office, we have 5 teams, 1 team for each IRB. We also looked at how departments had been assigned to those IRBs. We wanted to make sure that we had an equitable workload across the IRBs, and we wanted to have all of the work, new and existing, from a single PI be reviewed by the same team and the same IRB. So as I'm sure some of you know, we have moved some studies to different IRBs in our office so that the end result is the same PI sees the same people. And then we implemented a special 5-month training program for all of our staff because so many of them were going to be doing new work. The end result has been, as we hoped, that we'd have an increased consistency of review. Same person goes to the same IRB and the same team, and also we did this training program across the whole staff to bring everybody up to the same place. Almost all of our staff can provide advice about almost all kinds of research now, so you don't need to find the right specialist. And our turnaround times are far less affected by things like a staff vacancy or a lengthy vacation or any kind of workload fluctuation. They're just much easier to manage. So that project is essentially done. Streamline is a second project that we're about halfway through. The purpose of this is to sensibly simplify our processes, our forms, all of the documents that we use. One of the key parts of this is to remove you having to make a regulatory interpretation or decision. So for example, right now, when you get ready to submit a new application, you have to decide which one of our 5 different new forms you have to use. And that requires making some decisions like, do you think it's exempt? Do you think it qualifies for minimal risk? And so on. So we're taking that issue out of your hands so you don't have to make that decision by having 1 form instead of 5. We also need to harmonize some things with our electronic system, and we want to really simplify our forms and our processes. So this is part of the first page of our standard initial application, what's called the 1311 for reasons that are lost in the history of time. This will be replaced by a single other application that will hopefully be a lot easier to read, much easier to fill out, and that will take you through step by step what your study is and how to describe it to the IRB. So what we've already completed on this project is that, first of all, we've already implemented a number of changes to the process by which industry trials go to Western IRB instead of the UW IRB. Previously, there was a sequence that you had to go through of coming to us and then going to OSP for the contract negotiations, CRBB for the budget, and so on, before you could ever go to WIRB and get the IRB review started. We've changed that so the processes are now concurrent, and the end result is that instead of an average of 21 days in our office from when we receive it to sending it back to you, it's now 2 days, which is a big change. We've also clarified when the FDA regulations do and don't apply to certain kinds of research, And we've also instituted a change that we are no longer responsible for reviewing the HIPAA authorization form. We're actively revising our application forms, as I mentioned, and our SOPs and worksheets, and also the process by which you ask to be reviewed by a different IRB instead of us, or you ask us to help review one of your collaborators, so we avoid dual review. The results are that we've already started to see that there's more clarity for people about exactly what to do, and we hope that once we have this new form, certainly the delays associated with picking the wrong form are going to go away. We think the WORB clinical trial process will be even faster once we've finished all of these changes, and there will be far fewer situations where you have to get review from more than one IRB. So now this is the fun part. I like to talk about Zipline, our electronic IRB application system. So Zipline is intended to give you a clear path getting the IRB approval. How do you navigate that process? And it involves no more paper. Now, what exactly does that mean? What is Zipline like? Sometimes when people hear that there's no more paper, they envision a sort of TurboTax approach to IRB review, where you fill out a bunch of web forms, a bunch of check boxes, you maybe put in a few numbers and a little bit of text, and you're done. Well, that's not what Zipline is like. Instead, there are some web forms that you fill out, but mostly you upload and attach electronic documents to that web structure. So you'll still fill out an application form, but instead of printing the application form and making multiple copies and collating them and hand delivering them to HSD, where they get date stamped and they get things written all over them and they get put in a file, you'll just attach that electronic Word document to the website and hit submit. So that's what it means by paperless. They're still forms, but they're all electronic forms. There will be one application form, as I said, not 5 different application forms, and it's going to be called the IRB protocol instead of the 1311. Then you'll attach any other documents you have, just like you would enclose them in your packet now, consent forms, questionnaires, and so on. And one of the great features about this particular system, which has been in use for a couple of decades by many of our peers, it's very mature, is that you don't have to have a separate application form for a modification. Instead, you go into the system, you bring up your study application, and on the web forms, you change anything that you want to change, and that gets preserved by the system as track changes, so the reviewers can see that. And then you open up any of your attached documents, like your IRB protocol application form, you turn on track changes, you type in what you want to do, and you just upload it again. And then that's what gets approved and saved in the system. So it is much, much easier for everybody to do mods. And you don't have to comb through a stack of 20 old mods to figure out what the current status of your and state of your study is. It will also incorporate the requests for going to a different IRB, like WORB and the Cancer Consortium, so that process won't be separate anymore. And the department sign-off by the department chair, or whoever in the department does that, will be electronic and concurrent instead of sequential. So you don't have to get the signature first. You'll get it at the same time, and it's all electronic, sort of like the EGC1 form. So as soon as the PI hits submit on that application form, the system will automatically send an email to the department sign-off person telling them to go in the system and take a look. And that will happen at the same time that we start the review process. You'll be able to get real-time status about where the application is in the review process. And also, one nice feature for people that do a lot of similar research repeatedly, like say a medical records review, you can go in and copy an entire application and then just change the few pieces of it that maybe have changed for your next study. So it's much more convenient that way too. So this is when we're going to start rolling it out to campus. May 31st of next year, so not too many months away, is when we will start the rollout process. And what is that going to consist of? Well, first of all, we're going to turn the entire system on all at once. So it's not that we're just turning on little bits and pieces of it. Instead, we're turning the whole thing on at once, but we're only going to allow certain teams and departments to use it and then roll in more and more of them. So we'll start with one IRB and a few of the departments that IRB reviews. We haven't picked them yet. A couple of weeks later, we'll expand that and allow all of the departments that go to that IRB to use this. In the meantime, we'll be collecting a lot of information about how the system's working, about whether the training is effective and complete, and so on, so that we can make any tweaks at the end of that time frame. But we don't expect that to take very long. So we'll very quickly be rolling it out to the other IRBs in the same fashion, so that after a few months, we will have rolled it out to all of campus. Okay? So we're going to start with one IRB and a couple of departments, expand that to the one IRB and all of its departments, and then do the same thing with each of our other IRBs. Now, this is the question that we get asked about the most. What about the existing studies that are on paper in our office? Are we going to have to convert them to some kind of application in Zipline? And the answer is yes for most of them. And so I'll try to answer as many questions as I have here, and I know you'll have some later too. So first of all, which studies are going to have to be converted? Well, we know that we are not going to ask people with exempt studies to create any kind of an application in Zipline, so those are off the table. Applications that are in data analysis only will either do a very simple sort of basic presence in Zipline, or they will not be asked to convert at all. And there will be some really old, long, complicated studies that we'll consider on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not they should be converted and when and how. The when will be at the time of the next status report for most studies. So that means it will be spread out over at least the course of a year for you, because if you have multiple studies, you won't have to do them all at once. It would just be at the time of the status report. We'll have detailed instructions and training available, in person, online, paper documents, as many different ways as we can think of. We want this to be as easy and simple as possible for you and for us. What our peer institutions have told us is that the conversion process is the most difficult part of converting to an electronic system. So we're taking the advice that we've received from them in as many ways as possible to make it easy and as stress-free as possible. We're also looking into whether or not we'll have some additional staff time to help you on a one-on-one basis with conversions. Zipline is part of a bigger goal in the Office of Research. The Office of Research is working towards a 10-year goal of having a single web-based portal for researchers as a place to go to find out all of the administrative and compliance requirements and systems for any given study. Zipline is one component. All across campus, all of the other offices that are involved in research compliance and administration are developing or replacing or revising their own electronic systems. For example, the IACUC office has started to do this now. And the idea is that once we have all of these offices with their own electronic systems, then through the web portal we'll be able to link those systems together so that they talk together and are integrated to some degree, and then we'll have a single place for you to go as a portal. We'll be doing some of that with Zipline even before the other offices are completely ready to do the overall integration. For example, once we've rolled out Zipline to all of campus, we're going to be starting to work with radiation safety to try to integrate their process with ours so that maybe you only have to do one form, or it's all handled through our system, or some other way to make it efficient and tied together. This table shows our timelines for implementation of our 3 projects. As you can see from the top timeline, that represents the reorganization of our office. We're done with that project. We're a little more than halfway done with our Streamline project and with our Zipline electronic IRB process and project. And then, of course, our rollout begins on May 31st. Okay. So now I want to turn to the last major topic, and that has to do with the human subjects regulations. There have been a lot of big reports written by the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences and all sorts of professional organizations in the last 5 years about the problems with the human subjects regulations. They're out of date, they're inefficient, they create a lot of regulatory burden, they don't protect subjects well. There are all sorts of problems that people have recognized and written about. But until now, very little has actually been done about it. And then on September 8th, the Federal Office for Human Research Protections published some proposed revisions to the basic regulations. This is a very big deal. As you can see from this table, the last time they were revised was about 24 years ago, 1991. Think about all the things that have changed in our society and in research since that time. So it's no surprise that the regulations are a little stale and need some refreshing. So exactly what is changing? It's the basic generic regulations called the Common Rule. What's not changing, at least not yet, are the FDA regulations and the regulations about the protected populations of children, prisoners, and pregnant women. By the way, I see a few people taking notes. I should have mentioned we are going to be posting our PowerPoint on our website as well as a recording of this, if that helps. Also, the regulations of specific departments like Department of Defense and the Department of Justice are not going to be revised at this time. However, the FDA and OHRP have both said that they're actively working on regulation changes to theirs as well, and we expect to see those released sometime within the next year or two also. So almost all of the human subjects regulations are under active revision. Now, the approach that's being taken for the Common Rule is that the current and proposed regulations were evaluated within the context of the Belmont ethical principles. That is beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. They also took into account current and emerging trends in technology and data methods, so things like genomic analyses and the use of the internet and social media, big data science, and so on. And then they also took into account current and emerging social norms about a variety of things, like privacy on the internet and confidentiality of data and concerns about the use of biospecimens. So they took all of that into account, and what they came up with were these proposed regulations, which they believe strike a reasonable balance between protecting human research subjects, minimizing the burden and the inefficiency to that protection, and creating some public trust in the research enterprise. They feel that that is a really important component to consider. With respect to the goal of reducing burden to you and to the IRB office, the major changes are that, first of all, they're going to require a single IRB to do the review for all the domestic sites in a multi-site clinical trial. This is huge. So instead of being, say, for example, you have a 24-site clinical trial, instead of 24 different IRBs doing the review, one IRB would do the review. They also have created a new regulatory status called exclusions. Exclusions are activities that are explicitly called out as not being human subjects research, and therefore you don't need to do anything in order to do the research. This is distinct from exempt research, which is being expanded a little bit, in that exempt research also you don't have to comply with the regs, but exempt research is human subjects research, and you do have to come to our office to get that status awarded. So exclusions, you don't have to come to our office and you can just go ahead and do it. Exempt research, you have to go to the IRB office to get that status. One of the other interesting changes is that they're proposing that those annual status reports will no longer be required for any minimal risk study. That's a lot of studies here at the University of Washington. So that's, you would still have to do modifications if you change a study, but you wouldn't have to do those annual progress reports. Increased protections would be provided by requiring a short generic consent for the use of biospecimens, even if they're anonymous or de-identified. Also, they believe that increased protections are provided by providing more clarity in the regulations, getting rid of all those places that are ambiguous in the regs, so that everybody's applying the regs in exactly the same way across the country and certainly within an institution. They're also going to impose some very basic requirements for protecting research information. They haven't described what those are going to be yet, but their intent is for it to be a floor, a pretty basic level so that everybody has the same understanding. And they're also requiring a few new elements of consent for studies where it's appropriate. These mainly have to do with the use of biospecimens. So they want subjects to know if there's going to be any commercialization. They want subjects to know if they're going to get any results back. And they want subjects to be asked if they are willing to be recontacted for future studies. So these are just a few of the changes. The changes are described in a 131-page document. So it's a major document. It's not just a Band-Aid to a few known problems with the regs. It's a completely different approach to how we do our work. The biggest change has to do with biospecimens. The definition of a human subject is being expanded to include all biospecimens, whether or not they're identifiable. Currently, a biospecimen that's anonymous to at least you or de-identified to you isn't considered a human subject, and that means you don't need to get any kind of IRB approval to do any work with de-identified specimens. So for example, if you get residual clinical specimens here at Harborview, as long as you don't know who it's from, you don't need to come through our office to do that work. With these changes, that will change. You will need to have some kind of generic basic consent, and you will need to have some basic limited kind of IRB review process. They will be requiring a generic, non-study specific consent for specimens that are collected after the new regs start. In other words, we will need to ask our patients when they come into the hospital, is it okay if we use your leftover clinical specimens for research? We don't have to tell them what kind of research or when or who by who or anything else. We just need to get their basic permission. So these are some really big changes that are going to affect a lot of research on campus. When is this going to happen? So the regs were released on September 8th. There's a 90-day public comment period that ends on December 7th. And then there will be some unknown period of time when the federal regulators will look at those comments and decide whether or not to make any additional changes based on those comments. It's unlikely, very unlikely, to be any sooner than 6 months after the period, but it's also unlikely to be anything like 4 or 5 years. So everybody's kind of guessing they're going to try to publish the, quote, final rule before the end of the current presidential administration in January of 2017. We'll see. That's just a guess, wild speculation. Once that final rule is published, here's when things actually get implemented. They're allowing institutions to voluntarily implement all of the changes that will reduce work and make things more efficient 90 days after the publication of the final rule. So, for example, things like not requiring a status report for minimal risk studies. 1 year is the required implementation date for almost everything. But there are 2 changes for which they're giving institutions 3 years to implement them. That's the change with respect to the biospecimens and the use of a single IRB for reviews. The reason for that is that those two changes are really big changes that require significant structural things to be put in place. You have to figure out how you're going to be a central IRB, for example, if you're the one who gets selected to do that. And institutions are going to have to figure out how to approach their patients to get permission for residual clinical specimens. We're lucky here at the UW, we have something called the Northwest BioTrust that has already started to do this with many of our patients at some clinics. It does exactly what's laid out in these proposed regulations. So we've got a head start on a lot of institutions. But imagine a hospital, a large system in particular, that doesn't have anything set up. Even 3 years is not that much time to figure out how to approach patients, how to record it, how to get it linked to the medical record, and all that sort of thing in order to comply with these rules. So the bottom line is we've got a minimum, I would say, of 1.5 years or 2 years, maybe even 3 years before any of these changes take place. And the two really, really big ones are probably about 5 years away. This is interesting. NIH released a policy in January of this year called the Genomic Data Sharing Policy, and it foreshadows these changes about biospecimens in the human subjects regulations. The policy says that if you're doing any kind of genomic research and you're funded by NIH with any grant submitted after January 25th of this year, you're required to submit that genomic data to a database at NIH. Any one of several. And if you're doing it with specimens that you collect after January 25th, you have to have consent from the subjects in order to do the research and submit the data for this broad sharing through the database. It's very similar to the existing db-GAP procedure, but it's now been expanded to cover much more genetic research and many more databases at NIH. And you have to get the institutional certification to submit, like db-GAP, but you have to do it at the time you get your award. You can't wait until you're ready to send the data to NIH. So this is an interesting foreshadowing that's going to help us all get used to this new way of looking at biospecimens. Now, if you're worried about this, don't worry too much, because you will know if you are subject to this policy. You don't have to figure it out, and HSD doesn't have to figure it out. You'll be told in your notice of award from NIH that you have to comply with this policy. Within the next 4 weeks, we'll be rolling out some revisions to our db-GAP documents to help you figure out exactly how to navigate this process. But if you've done the db-GAP process before, you're not going to see much that's changed here. It'll be very familiar. Okay, so with that, I just want to conclude by reminding you that one way to stay in touch about what's going on and coming is to subscribe to our monthly newsletter. We will be doing lots and lots of extra communication beyond that as we get ready to roll out our electronic system and as we hear more about the revised regulations. And with that, yes, I am done, and I'd be happy to take questions. Yes.
The new application form that you guys are going to roll out, you're calling it the IRB protocol. Is that going to take the place of our actual study protocol? Because to have something, we have protocols for all of our studies, so having two documents with the same name would be really confusing.
Yes. The question is, the IRB protocol form, is that going to take the place of an existing protocol that you might have from a company, for example?
Well, we write our own.
Or that you write your own, and isn't that kind of a confusing name to have that term? I agree with you, it's a little confusing. There are a few things in this vendor product that we're installing, the Zipline product, that we can't change without significant cost and time and effort. And one of them, oddly enough, is the name for the application form. It's specified in the software as IRB protocol, unfortunately.
So it won't take the place?
It will not take the place of your actual protocol.
It's an application form?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the changes, just to give you a little foreshadowing, I probably shouldn't do this, but I'll do it anyway. is that we are going to allow people to refer to sections of other documents instead of regurgitating them on the application form. So if you have an existing protocol, a formal protocol, and you want to upload that into our new system, you can refer to a section of that instead of copying and pasting it into the application form. Other questions? Yes.
For the HIPAA authorization forms you mentioned for like the work studies, you'll no longer be reviewing them, but for regular studies, you'll continue to review HIPAA forms. Is that correct?
The question has to do with whether or not we're still reviewing HIPAA forms for regular studies. We're actually not reviewing them for any study. We implemented that change a couple of, Sherry, do you remember, 3 or 4 months ago, 5 months ago, something like that. So you don't have to turn in HIPAA authorization forms with any applications to our office or to WERB. The reason for that is that it is UW Medicine or whatever covered entity is giving you the PHI that's responsible for making sure that any authorization form has all the required elements. It's not a human subjects requirement for IRBs to review and approve that form. So we've been looking for examples of things that we've been doing that were completely redundant with other offices and requirements, and this is one of them. So we no longer need to even see the authorization form. As long as you use the UW authorization form to get UW PHI, we don't need to see it. Yes?
Will there be any changes to the confidentiality agreement?
Oh, good question. Will there be any changes to the confidentiality agreement? There will be changes on Friday. So I'm hoping there will be more changes in the future. So I'll give you the long range view first. Our office's view is that that particular law, which is a Washington state law, that requires that the use of any institutional records from a public institution of higher education and certain state agencies has to have a confidentiality agreement between the agency and the researcher if you're not going to have consent from the subjects. So if you want to use student records or medical records without consent, in addition to getting the waiver of consent, you have to have this confidentiality agreement. We believe that law is completely redundant with all sorts of other federal protections like HIPAA and FERPA and so on. And in fact, the state law was passed long before those laws ever came into existence, and it's never been revised. So we have asked this year to have that as one of the laws that is proposed to the state legislature for being rescinded, or for at least taking the institutions of higher education off the list. We'll see how that goes. So my goal is to get rid of it entirely. I'm really hoping, I'm pushing hard. In the meantime, what we're doing this Friday is that we're releasing a slightly revised version of the template that gives more clear explanation for how to do the template and especially how to modify the agreement with the minimum amount of work. It's a little bit more efficient now to modify a confidentiality agreement. And on top of that, we're no longer asking you to tell us when you're going to destroy the identifiers. It's not required by law. The only thing that's required by law is that you do destroy identifiers when the purposes of the study are completed. And for some studies, that may mean keeping them indefinitely. So those are the changes. Did I capture them all, Sherry? I think that's it, yeah. Barbara.
For the zip line, I'm intrigued. And for some of the stuff where you're talking about like uploading the protocol, would that be the same for the grant? If we have it in an electronic form, you just attach it and so.
Yes, the question is, will you still electronically attach everything in addition to the application form, for example, the grant? And the answer is yes. So you would just upload the electronic version of the grant, your questionnaires, your application form, the consent form. All of it will reside there in the system. So in some sense, it's your electronic file system for your study records, your non-data containing study records. And you can refer to sections of the grant in the application form instead of copying and pasting. Mm-hmm. Yes?
For the permission for biospecimens, kind of big picture, residual biospecimens, is the consent people give likely to include genetics, DNA analysis?
Is the generic consent for biospecimens, I assume you're talking about the revised regulations here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's coming with, we have the Northwest Biotrust as sort of our starting point.
Right. Is that generic consent going to make reference to doing genetic research? And yes, that is the expectation. The Federal Regulatory Agency is going to provide us with what they want in that really short generic consent form. They haven't done so yet, but judging from everything else they've said, it will clearly refer to the possibility of doing genetic research. Yeah. Any other questions? Training, zip line, application form, office reorganization. Yes.
I have a question about the office reorganization. We just put through a modification for translated flyers, and then we got it translated into 2 other languages. The first one was passed, put in the second one. Now they're asking for every single document we have for, that we approach subjects with, which it's a very complicated study. We have flyers, we have consent forms, we have information sheets. I mean, it's tons, and they want to know the modification date, what version it is. I mean, it's taking me hours to compile, and I'm curious why, if they approve one in one language, when I come back with 2 other languages with the exact same form, they're now asking for all this information again when it's in our records there at HSD.
And are you bringing this up in the context of reorganization because
Yes.
it changed from one team to another?
Yes.
Yeah. So the question had to do with being asked for some documents now that in the past you haven't been asked for with a different team and a different IRB. I would feel free to contact the lead of that team, which you can find out from our contact page on our website, and contact the lead and ask for a better understanding of why. And it may be that there's a misunderstanding in the new team and you don't need it, or that something was overlooked on the older team. But it sounds like it would be perfectly appropriate for you to ask for the reason why that's.
Well, it was just last week
Uh-huh.
to this week, so, I mean, it was after the change had already been made, and
Mhm.
so I'm just confused why the same team all of a sudden needs all this additional.
I would definitely contact the team lead for that team and ask them to look into it and get back to you. Anything else? Yes.
How is Zipline going to affect the stamping process of all of the documents? Will we still have to keep track of the consent forms with the stamps on them and
Mhm.
other documentation that the subjects receive? Will there still be that requirement, or how will that look?
So the question is, how will Zipline affect the stamping of documents, and how will you keep track of that? Will there still be a requirement for you to use stamped documents with subjects? Yes, you will still be required to use the stamped documents when that's appropriate. There are occasions when that's not a good idea. And that will all be handled electronically in Zipline. So there's basically a macro in the electronic software that when we go in and we enter the final approval and indicate that it's been granted, there's basically a button that we push that electronically stamps or applies a watermark to whatever documents we have specified as requiring stamping. We're going to minimize the number of documents that get stamped. It'll basically be consent documents and assent and parental permission documents. And then that will reside in the system. It will be stored there, so you won't have to keep track of it. You could just go up there and print out a copy of the consent form directly from Zipline when you need one. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Are you gonna have, approval letter that we get that will list everything that was approved, that we submitted? I know a lot of times the transplanting agencies do that.
Mhm. Yes.
And if we don't have something to scan, to send them,
Mhm.
we have one listings of everything that was approved.
So the question has to do with how are we going to document and provide documentation for approval? Is there going to be an approval letter that lists everything that's been approved? We don't have that right now for our paper system, as you all know. We will have that in Zipline. The system itself has templates that it will draw in information and it will attach the names of the documents that we've approved. We'll just put in a little, very little bit of customization in that template, and then it will be electronically, it will reside in the system, and you will be sent a notice when it's ready. You will also, I think, get it as an attachment. So let me start off. So you will get an approval letter by email, and it will also live in the Zipline system with your study so that you can copy it or paste it or send it wherever you need to send it. Yeah. That's going to be a nice big change. It'll be great.
So, kind of more on Zipline.
Mhm.
Will multiple people be able to access the application, like contact the PI? And, you know, like when you submit it, do you say, here's who I want to access it, or how does that work?
Right. Will multiple people be able to access a study? Yes. That is entirely up to the PI. There's a couple of ways that this can happen. One is that when the PI goes in and creates a study, that PI can determine who is going to be a PI proxy, which is sort of like the current IRB contact is. And they can also specify who else is going to be on the study team and who would, therefore would have access to the application. In addition, they can also identify people as being guests. Guests cannot modify the application, but they can see it. So, for example, a collaborator at another institution. The other route is that PIs, when they are in Zipline, can at any time, first time through or whenever they want, change the profile that exists for them in Zipline. We're going to be drawing on existing systems at the university for things like box number and email address and so on. But PIs can also go in and specify a default PI proxy and also a default study team, so that when they create a new application after that, those people are automatically identified as having access. And then they can continue to revise that as they want.
Okay, so it always, for, let's say, a new application, the PI always has to initiate that, and then you can designate. Or-
Right.
Okay.
Although they can do it in sort of a generic way at the very beginning if they want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that,
Mhm.
I mean, I think a lot of RPIs involve the main coordinator to initiate the study and then to review and follow up with their approval. Would that
Mhm.
sort of be possible?
So the question is, a lot of PIs would want their PI proxy to initiate and follow up on studies. And Sherry, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that once a PI has identified somebody as the PI proxy in their profile, that PI proxy can initiate starting a new application. But it's always going to be the PI themselves that have to actually click on the submit button to send the application to us. And what that involves is they just log into the system with their UWNet ID. They go to a page that has 3 sentences on it that are assurances, and they click submit. That's all they have to do. Yes?
Once that initial application is done, then the department gets a notification to send it, but after that, the PI proxy can do modifications, all that stuff. Our PI, got 6 studies that has not ever done an IRB thing, so, not, it's a good thing, it's not critical, but just, but it just already worries me that it'll be bogged down for a second. So, but once they submit it, then the proxy can do everything else.
Yes, once they get it set up for a proxy, then the proxy can do everything else except that actual submit. So that'll be a key thing when we go out to campus and we're doing a lot of education and helping you all learn the new system. That's the thing we're really going to emphasize with the PIs, is to pick out a PI proxy, and that the most efficient thing to do is to put that in your profile rather than doing it on a study-by-study basis.
I assume a PI can have multiple proxies because,
Yes, there can be multiple proxies for PIs, yeah.
I know, we keep asking questions about Zipline. I did the training, it was great.
Oh, good.
But I still have a lot of questions. Modifications, so right now it's that big long form, it's like, what are the changes you're making, why are you making them, and you had said during the talk that you would just open up your protocol and do track changes in there, but that's not gonna give you your reasons for why you're changing it. We would still see your old one, and then the new version, just, yeah, it's a little.
Right,
Because
so
are
the-
you gonna have a form in addition to doing all these track changes to all these other documents that describe the changes you're doing? Does this question make sense?
Sure, I think the
Okay.
question boils down to how are we going to know why you're proposing the changes you're making if we don't have a form that you have to fill out?
Right.
Does that sort of sum it up?
Basically,
Yeah.
yeah.
So one of the nice things about the system is that no matter what you're doing and where you are in the state of your study and the status of its review, you can always send us a note through the system. There's a little button on the activities that are available to you where you can send a note or you can upload a letter. So if you're proposing modifications, you don't necessarily need to tell us why if you think it's really obvious. Or you can put it right in the application when you say, I want to increase my study sample from 100 to 200. You can say, I want to increase from 100 to 200 because. Or you can just attach a letter or write a little note electronically. So that's one of the nice features. You can do that at any point, yeah, with your study, is just communicate with us that way. And of course, you can always pick up the phone and call us too. Yes?
Kind of bouncing off what she said, so is there a way to, like, if you do a track change to a consent form, are you able, like the DOD, for example, you have to tell them all of our different track changes that we make and different versions we've had, so is there a way to, like, go back and does it say previous changes in separate documents, or is it just all one document and you kind of just have to figure out when the track changes?
Right.
That was kind of what I was trying to get at too.
Okay, so I think the question has to do with changes and how they're tracked and documented in the system. Are they tracked and documented? And the answer is yes, they are. There's a history tab for every single study, and that history tab has every single document that's been modified there. So it will have each tracked change version of the consent form. The only one that will show in the primary current view of the study is the one that's currently approved. But by going to that history tab, you can always get the track changes version of anything that you changed in the study. So the whole thing is there. It's just that the current view shows only what's currently approved. Okay, so I think we're done with the room, and I believe we have to give up the room to some other people shortly thereafter, right? That's why
As
you
far as I
could.
know,
Yeah. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions if you want to come up afterwards. Otherwise, thank you for coming. We appreciate it.